So there's this dance called the cakewalk. It was popular in the second half of the 19th century. If you've never seen a cakewalk before, it's sort of like this showy promenade. In this one video from 1903, a handful of black men and women are dressed in their Sunday best. Fancy jackets with tailcoats, top hats, frilly dresses with puffed sleeves, and they're prancing around, twirling their canes, doing high kicks, bending their knees every which way. Their noses are almost up in the air.
In its earliest reported form, the cakewalk was an intricately executed walking step.
The accompanying music, also known as cakewalks, were a precursor to ragtime, the iconic musical genre that started, in part, right here in Missouri.
Couples formed a square, the men placing themselves on the inside. The music was played in a moderate march tempo, while the dancers strutted along, performing neat maneuvers at each of the corners.
It's exaggerated and flamboyant, almost to a comical extent. And that's the point.
What's so interesting about the cakewalk is that on paper, it seems like it's just this really popular formal dance. But if you dig into it, it's actually this subversive performance that has really deep historical roots in Black resistance.
This is my colleague, Julie Denesha, KCUR's arts reporter. She's the one who first told me about this dance. When you say it's subversive, what does that mean?
Well, the Black people who are performing this dance, they're mimicking the way a slave owner might promenade at a formal ball.
So the dance is almost in jest.
Yeah, Black people on southern plantations, which included Missouri because it was a slave state, were exposed to formal European dances like waltzes by watching white people. In turn, they'd imitate and parody the dances they saw, and white people became fascinated with these imitations, which got their name because the couple judged as the best dancers were awarded a prize cake.
I gotta ask, what kind of cake are we talking about?
Oh man, they were these huge, elaborate, multi-tiered kinds of cakes. And often the judges who awarded them were wealthy members of white society.
I have the honor to announce that couple number 3 wins the cake.
You know, the dance started at the tail end of slavery, and it became an even bigger thing after the Civil War. It wasn't long before white performers started coming up with their own versions, sometimes in blackface, and often in minstrel shows, which were these outrageously offensive parodies of Black culture.
So even though cakewalks were, in essence, Black people imitating white people dancing, the white people then went on to imitate the imitations.
Yeah, white people really didn't get that Black people were mocking them. And today, you know, people are more familiar with minstrel shows, and they really don't know how nuanced and important the history of the cakewalk is, which is really too bad. And there's this one man in particular I have to tell you about. His name is almost synonymous with the cakewalk. He traveled to Washington, D.C., and he went on to win the World Championship at Madison Square Garden in 1893. And he lived right here in Kansas City.
Ladies and gentlemen, the cakewalk.
This is A People's History of Kansas City. I'm Mackenzie Martin, and on this episode, Kansas City's champion cakewalker.
He was winning cakewalks left and right all over the country.
It was probably the first dance craze we had in this country.
Dance craze.
While the dancers strutted along,
Dance craze.
Wasn't long before I realized I was creating something beautiful.
The cakewalk.
Okay, Julie, who is this performer you speak of?
So this guy's name is William Henry Joseph Cutter Brown.
That's a very long name.
Yeah, that's why people called him Doc Brown. And I found out about the story totally by happenstance. I was in Kansas City's historic Union Cemetery last fall working on another story, and I saw this flyer about a championship dancer from Missouri.
What did the flyer look like?
It's like raise money for this tombstone for this champion dancer. And it had a QR code, which doesn't sound very exciting.
I don't know. I'm intrigued, and obviously you were too.
I'm the person who always goes to like message boards or places where people post things. I'm always interested in whatever is going on, weird stuff. That's me.
So what did you learn?
I found out that this guy from LA Galen Wilkes, was raising money to get a headstone for Doc Brown. Because up until now, he didn't have a headstone. He was buried in an unmarked grave. And it was something that really bothered him.
He was a star here in Kansas City, but he was also known throughout Missouri, the Midwest, and even to the East Coast. He did, probably hundreds of cakewalks over the years, winning many of them.
This is Galen Wilkes. He's this ragtime enthusiast turned expert.
I've been involved in ragtime music and history for over 45 years.
He got interested in ragtime music in the 1970s, when the movie The Sting came out, and it had a completely ragtime soundtrack. Galen's organized ragtime dances, a ragtime orchestra, a ragtime festival in New England, and he's even composed a few tunes himself. But he's particularly passionate about preserving the history of the genre.
Over 40 years ago, some of the ragtimers began marking the unmarked graves of some of the composers and continued this tradition.
He's helped mark the graves of some of the biggest composers of the era, like Arthur Marshall and James Scott. Most of them right here in Missouri.
It's crazy how many composers are from Missouri, actually. Like, my knowledge of ragtime is not extensive, but I do know that Scott Joplin, who is the king of ragtime, he lived in Sedalia and St. Louis. I feel like even if you don't know Scott Joplin, you've heard Scott Joplin.
Yeah, ragtime really did originate here in Missouri, in the saloons and pool halls of cities like Sedalia and St. Louis. But people don't necessarily know that. That's why Galen and other enthusiasts are trying to give these people proper headstones.
There's probably maybe around 10 tombstones that have been put up since the 80s. And I just started thinking about Doc, and I thought, I wonder if he's got one. It turned out he didn't.
And while ragtime's still popular, Galen says people really don't know about the cakewalk, which is crazy because that's where ragtime begins.
So yeah, where does the cakewalk fit in with ragtime?
Well, performers would dance to this early form of ragtime. And the music and the dance have influenced American culture in ways that we don't even know about, even our language. Skilled performers were expected to make even the most difficult moves look easy, like a piece of cake.
It's not going to be a cakewalk, but I think...
well, this will be a piece of cake.
A cakewalk's the nomination.
A piece of cake to go through Boston.
It would be like a cakewalk compared to an actual Marine boot camp.
And of course, everybody's probably heard the expression, that takes the cake, meaning that wins the prize. That's where it comes from. It goes back to the cakewalk.
What was so unique about Doc Brown's cakewalks? Why was he so much better at this than everyone else?
To get into Doc Brown, I've got to introduce you to Glenn North. He's this award-winning poet, activist, and educator, and Doc Brown's become an important part of his work and his life.
So this Doc Brown, he's been following me around for quite a long time now.
Glenn's also the director of Inclusive Learning and Creative Impact at the Kansas City Museum, and hanging on the wall, there's this large picture of Doc Brown painted in 1896.
It's a black man dressed in a tuxedo, but he's kind of bent over and he's got his top hat tipped and he's got this really kind of friendly smile. And to me, I immediately thought he looked kind of like a minstrel.
These are the performers in the minstrel show, which involved white performers wearing blackface.
Yeah. Black performers were fetishized by white people, and they were depicted almost as these caricatures in pop culture. When Glenn first saw this painting of Doc Brown 12 years ago, he wasn't really sure what to think about the painting or Doc Brown.
To be honest with you, when you look at someone like Doc Brown, it evokes kind of this sense of, this perpetuation of certain stereotypes that were used to keep black people in a subservient kind of position.
At the time, the Kansas City Museum didn't have a lot of artifacts on the black experience in their collection. So Glenn decided to look a little deeper. Glenn North found out that Doc Brown was born into slavery around 1835, enslaved to Meredith Miles Marmaduke, the 8th governor of Missouri. Doc grew up on the Marmaduke Plantation near Arrow Rock. It was in a place called Little Dixie.
He was enslaved there for 30 years, but during that time, he had become known as a very proficient cakewalker.
This is how Glenn found out about the cakewalk. And it wasn't just some frivolous dance. It had this deeper meaning.
When I realized that even the cakewalk itself was kind of this subversive kind of dance in a way for people who were enslaved to kind of poke fun of the slave owners, I was able then to view Doc Brown differently. My inclination was then to celebrate him rather than to feel shame about him and who he was.
Missouri's most cantankerous storyteller, Mark Twain, wrote about a big cakewalk event in the 1890s. He described it as a competition of elegant deportment, full of elaborately dressed couples who marched in front of no less than 500 spectators. Twain wrote, "All that the competitor knows of fine airs and graces, he throws into his carriage. All that he knows of seductive expression, he throws into his countenance."
I have no idea what that means.
Neither do I. Basically, what you really need to know about the cakewalk is that it was huge.
Couple number 3 wins the cake.
It was probably the first dance craze we had in this country.
This is Galen Wilkes again, and he says in particular, it was the dancing in combination with this new catchy syncopated sound that took the world by storm.
It couldn't be contained, and it spread beyond America's borders. Thomas Edison sent phonographs to the crown heads of Europe and other countries. Teddy Roosevelt also did the cakewalk.
Ladies and gentlemen, the cakewalk.
It was a competition, and you showed off.
So I get that it was a dance that became synonymous with like a type of music, but I have to ask, what is syncopated sound?
Well, syncopation is kind of complicated to describe. It's this disruption of the regular flow of rhythm that you'd hear in, say, a march. I had musician Kevin Sanders describe it to me.
Cakewalks and syncopation was simpler. It was contained within the bar. So a typical cakewalk rhythm would be dun, dun, dum. And ragtime, they got more complex with the syncopation. The syncopations would extend over the bar. You had the syncopations on even more odd beats like 16ths. And then when jazz came along, it was like syncopation gone crazy.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful.
And what you're listening to now is a song that Doc Brown inspired. Doc Brown's Cakewalk was written by Kansas City's Charles L. Johnson, a contemporary of Scott Joplin. It was one of Johnson's first big hits. You could buy the sheet music for 15 cents or get a piano roll for your player piano. You could also hear Doc Brown's Cakewalk on music boxes and later on a record.
It's honestly crazy how big this song was and how many people knew who Doc Brown was at the turn of the century.
Totally. And all of this might not have happened if he hadn't made the decision to move to Kansas City after emancipation in 1865. He just really outgrew his hometown.
One of his friends that he grew up with in Arrow Rock, he told Doc Brown, like, your personality's too big for this small town. You need to move to the big city. And Kansas City was, relatively a big city at that time.
Hi, I'm Celia Morton, the KCUR Studios intern. Did you know that there are dozens of more episodes of A People's History of Kansas City that you can listen to right now? If you like this episode, I might suggest Kansas City's Raunchy Blues Queen about Julia Lee,
If it's good, then I want it.
who made a national name for herself, even though her music was too risque to be played on the radio.
If it's good.
And now back to the episode.
Okay, so at some point, Doc Brown leaves his small hometown for the big city, Kansas City. What was going on in KC at the time?
In the late 1800s, Kansas City was booming. It had the first permanent rail bridge across the Missouri River, which quadrupled the city's population over the next 50 years. And the Kansas City stockyards were the country's second largest meatpacking industry. And all these things combined meant people in town were hungry for entertainment. It was the perfect time for a 5'3" natural-born cakewalker to make Kansas City home.
Doc Brown came to Kansas City and won this huge cakewalking contest and went on to national celebrity. He was winning cakewalks left and right all over the country.
This is Glenn North at the Kansas City Museum again. And it's so important to note that Doc Brown's success was incredibly rare for a black man at the time.
For Doc Brown to come to Kansas City and to seek fame and fortune and to be successful at it. I don't know about the fortune part, but certainly the fame aspect of it just really speaks to how charismatic he must have been.
Something I'm curious about is his name. Where did Doc come from? He obviously wasn't like a physician.
Yeah, well, he definitely not a physician. And at the peak of his fame, he had so many nicknames. He was called Professor Doc Brown of the Sugar Heel, Champion of the Sponge Cake Amble, Prince of the Mincing Step, King of the Order of Mixed Gates, Cakewalk Champion of Missouri and the world, or more often, just the Doc. Doctor being the title of esteem bestowed upon him by his friends. And he was a confident guy. Doc himself said, "I am the originator of the cakewalk in all of the United States and Missouri."
Wait, people don't credit Doc Brown with the creation of the cakewalk, do they?
Let's just say he was a performer prone to overstatement.
So no.
But the man knew how to put on a show.
The wedding cakewalk is around the bend.
Okay, I've got to show this picture. So this is at a Mammoth Cakewalk in Washington, D.C. in 1900.
He's got a top hat. He's holding a cane. Are those ribbons on the cane?
Yeah, he's got these ribbons. He seems happy. He seems confident in the photo.
You can see he's got maybe some medals around.
They actually described him as having his entire breast covered with medals that he won since 1861.
That sounds heavy.
That does sound heavy.
Okay, so clearly he was like the hometown favorite.
Yeah, from all the newspapers I read, he really seemed like he was a really big deal. And it's awkward because Glenn North says when you read them today, the articles sound kind of condescending.
We're reporting on him, but we're also kind of making fun of him at the same time.
Reporters would often quote Doc Brown in dialect.
You have to be careful about who you allow to tell the stories of the history of black people and people of color. Oftentimes, we're not the ones telling those stories.
I am really glad that Glenn is bringing up this point. It is something I think about a lot as a white person, and it's why I know I try and use archival audio in interviews whenever I can, because it does do a much better job of amplifying stories. But from the early 1900s, you don't really have a lot to work with.
Yeah.
Which is really too bad.
Despite the challenges, Glenn says you can still get a sense of who Doc Brown was from these articles.
While he might not have spoken the King's English, as we say, perfectly, when you read those quotes, you can still kind of capture some of his swag and some of his panache.
The Colored American, Washington, D.C., 1900. One of the most amusing features of the evening will be Doc Brown of Kansas City, Missouri.
The Kansas City Journal, 1989. Doc Brown, Kansas City's own, was the bright particular star and first prize winner at a New Year cakewalk in Gallatin.
Doc made the hit of his life not only with the artistic gyration of his feet, but with his spellbinding oratory.
You know, Doc Brown was the performer people came to see. And if he didn't win, people got fired up about it.
1897, the Kansas City Journal. Bitter, bitter is this cup. Our Doc Brown beaten by a St. Louis dude.
1898, the Kansas City Times. Doc Brown is robbed. Prize cake taken out of the very hands of the walker.
Had the judges been less honorable men, Brown partisans might hold them open to suspicion.
But at some point, though, as Doc gets older, he starts losing more than winning. These younger dancers were coming in and eclipsing him, which was devastating for him.
He was a sore loser, quite frankly, if you read some of those articles.
The audience hissed the deposed king when, not satisfied with his first showing, he came on for a second trial.
It was them new regulations, moaned the ex-champion of hundreds of cakewalks in the agony of his soul after the decision of the judges had been announced.
These thoughts plagued him until he was on his deathbed at Kansas City Hospital in February 1905. Doc Brown told a reporter from the Kansas City Star that he wanted his physicians to patch him up so he could get out in the sunshininess, as he called it, to redeem his lost cakewalker record. But alas, he died of tuberculosis.
I'm sure a lot of that was tethered to the fact that his identity was so deeply rooted in this fact that he had gained recognition as being this champion cakewalker that he held onto that very dearly.
So has Kansas City ever celebrated Doc Brown, like historically in some way?
I mean, I've lived in Kansas City my whole life, and I had never heard of him before, and I've certainly never heard him celebrated. But all of that's changing in a couple big ways, starting with Glenn North. Like I said, Glenn has been on this real journey of discovery with Doc Brown, and so he wrote a play about him. And he's never done anything like this before.
I don't necessarily feel as proficient in writing for theater, but I decided to give it a shot.
He even got a residency to write it in Arrow Rock, Doc Brown's birthplace. The original play debuted in May, and the theater in Arrow Rock was packed. And for a few minutes, Doc Brown was back on top.
They couldn't do no real dances like the juba, the jig, or the pigeon wing. You know, dances that require you to have some rhythm in your bones. Anyhow, we started imitating how they danced to poke fun at them. Turns out they got a kick out of watching us do them dances, not even knowing they was the butt of joke.
I love to research a lot of these historic characters because they are real life. It was like I just knew who this person was.
That's Darrell Reuben Hall, who played Doc Brown.
I love Black history, and there's so many stories that need to be told. That's all a part of the American fabric. Thankfully, I'm still flexible for my age, so I can do the high kicks, the high stepping, knee lifting, the big smiles, everything that they did in that time period.
And the really exciting thing about this play is it was so successful earlier this year that now they're premiering it in Kansas City this week.
Glenn's work brought the humanity of this man's life from the page to the stage.
It's really kind of remarkable that this person from this small town in Missouri who was born on a plantation would eventually achieve national celebrity. But if you think about it, Black folks have always been able to take whatever it is that we've been given and to make something new, right? Like we still are singing songs and reading poetry and studying even the visual art that came out of that era because that was one of the few things that we had agency in. There's just a deep, earnest, heartfelt, authentic kind of way that we create that I think is really unique. And I think that definitely Doc Brown is an example of that.
Back in May, after the first run of the play was complete, Darrell Reuben Hall did one last thing before he got on his plane home.
I was getting ready to fly back to New York, and we had some extra time. So we were like, let's go by the cemetery, see if we can find where he's buried.
Yes, we're finally getting back to this. Okay, so there was this group of people. They're raising money for Doc Brown to get a headstone.
Yeah, Galen Wilkes was behind this whole movement to get him a gravestone.
When he died, they had to take up a collection to bury him.
It's like a really familiar story. Even Scott Joplin didn't have a headstone for decades.
They were artists, performers, whatever. They fell on hard times or they just didn't have much money to begin with.
So did the campaign do well?
Yeah, now he's got a headstone.
Yay, good.
All of Galen's hard work, it just culminated in like this one special day at the historic Union Cemetery.
So set the scene. What did this look like?
The band Rhythmia was set up
And tune that one out.
underneath the trees.
Okay. Close enough for ragtime, huh?
There were all these people there, and they were all there to celebrate Doc Brown. It was kind of magical to be there on this Sunday morning, and the sun was shining, and it was a little bit windy. They played cakewalk after cakewalk, but obviously they had to play Doc Brown's cakewalk.
He had dozens of titles and nicknames, with a lot of them inflated, as they often were. My favorite is Cakewalk Champion of the Universe. And I've always wondered how they did the cakewalk in Alpha Centauri.
I like that it's all coming full circle for Doc.
Yeah, it was kind of emotional.
Took 119 years.
And now we can remember him. Now we have a place to go. Galen cut the cake. Everyone got a piece. And it was really nice. I mean, they had to have cake.
Here's to Doc. Long may he cakewalk.
Glenn North's play about Doc Brown, Consummate Showman, will be performed at Community Christian Church Friday, August 16th. More info is at kcur.org/People's History. A People's History of Kansas City was reported this month by Julie Denesha and produced and mixed by me, Mackenzie Martin, with Celia Morton. Editing by Luke Martin and Suzanne Hogan. Special thanks this episode to our turn-of-the-century newspapermen, Byron Love and Zane Irwin, the Mar Sound Archives, and Evan Verplew. You heard music by Sousa's Band, Tony Parenti's Ragtimers, Holizna, Scott Joplin, Arthur Marshall, James Scott, Russ Morgan and his orchestra, Charles L. Johnson, Fred Astaire and the Delta Rhythm Boys, and Blue Dot Sessions. Additional clips from the WGBH Educational Foundation, Cakewalk into Darktown, Stormy Weather, PBS NewsHour, CUNY TV, WGBH Radio, WUMB, and Louisiana Public Broadcasting. We are a production of KCUR Studios, a podcast network in Kansas City, Missouri, and we'll be back in your feeds in September with a story about a very unique and prolific Kansas City librarian.
She would always walk around with a beret and leather driving gloves.
Until then, I'm Mackenzie Martin. Thank you so much for listening.